I'd like to do a little bit about St. Lucia. St. Lucia, as I mentioned earlier, was settled by Native Baha'i Esther Evans. And she was joined, Lillian Middlemast came with her, but only stayed about a year. There was another family that named Hopmers. I have no idea how long they stayed there. Esther remembered them, but not. But the real activities on a more of an island-wide basis started when the Trutzes came, Henrietta and Phil Trutze, and they brought their children. You see, Esther, the way Esther would teach on the island was by making friends, getting to know people. It was more a level of proclamation than actual, firesides and this type of stuff. So the faith then, because of the beauty and the character of this woman, received a very good reputation. So it was well prepared for the next stage. And then when the Trutzes came, they began to do, particularly Henrietta. Henrietta was very, physically she was very lovely and very warm, very friendly. She was a tall, slim woman, and she just sort of enveloped people when she came up to them. So they always felt this connection with Henrietta. And she was a real teacher. And she opened up the Jack Mel, which was in Roseau Valley, which is where the first Baha'i community actually started. So by 1967, they were one of the assemblies, and they sent a delegate to St. Thomas for the first formation. And the community itself was really very, very active. I mean, the people loved what they heard. Their first real opposition and trouble came from the Catholic Church, because at that time they were not government schools. So what happened is that the priests, as they begin to see, 30, 40, 50 people starting to become Baha'is, began to be concerned about it. So they then went to the Baha'is and they said, look, if you want to stay Baha'i, fine. You can take your children out of schools, our schools, and let the Baha'is educate them, okay? And there was in the files communication with the House of Justice about starting a school, but it was way too soon. It was much too premature to do. But that community hung on and stayed on for a long time. By 1974, however, the Trutzes had left the island, and the next couple of years were really sort of things had all settled down and there were no activities. And Esther, by this time, had moved way out to Grosselet, another part of it, and didn't get in much. She was getting up in years by this time, no longer working, so her contact was very limited. At this stage, some of the local travel teachers used to come from the different islands, and this is always really a good sign. People like Don Providence, like Errol Seeley, Emmanuel Dick came over, and they worked then with the team, with the consular, with Roland Estall and Shirley Yarborough, who was board member, and myself, representing the NSA. So we worked as a team on these islands, but I mean, it was really nothing. Nothing that would sustain itself over a period. And then Frank lost his job. We were over in Dominica by this time, and he lost his job over here. And the NSA said, well, if you can get a job over in St. Lucia, this would be a great place for you to go. And as one might expect from a Baha'i story, the job opened up, and we moved over. And I think this has been more of our role in the West Indies. We're sort of like what I think of as door kickers. Nothing seems to be happening, and because our family was a unit, we were able to go in and things would start, okay? So we worked there for a while. Frank Fernandez came from Barbados for a while. Beverly March came, and she was fantastic because she was the first West Indian pioneer. So because now people could see this identification of someone other than white people spreading the religion. Okay? And Beverly was like Henrietta, warm and loving, but yet very open. And she taught school at Castries. And she was very influential in letting people know about the faith. It was she who did the interview with Dr. Mohajer on television, okay? And we always had very good media response in St. Lucia. we could get whatever time we wanted to. So this one interview that we had with Dr. Mohajer, where Beverly was doing the interview, he says to her, "My dear," he says, "now you ask your questions." He says, "and if we go over time a little bit, it's all right." He says, "I will pay for it." Okay? Now they tell me this later. They don't tell me first, because I'm the one that has to arrange for the time. See, the time is free. So I'm really concerned that we get the time right. Well, we go up to the studio and they start to talk and they start to talk, and from the 5 to 10 minutes that we had of free time, Dr. Mohajer talked 45. And everybody was fascinated at the studio. And I was fascinated, but my heart was beating faster, because here's this long thing. The next morning, the station manager calls me up, and he says, "Mrs. Paccassi," he says, "that was really a fascinating talk," he says, "your man gave last night." He says, "but it was a bit long." So I learned my lesson right there. Don't question hands. They know what they're doing a lot better than you do. It was great. A year later, in '79, the Bloodworth family came, and they were an enormous help on this island. And they're dedicated people. They were young people. They had young children. Well, they had brought one child, and the other child was born on the island. Badi was born on St. Lucia, as well as my youngest grandson was also born. And the Berries, our oldest daughter and son-in-law, were there. They had an oldest son, and their youngest son was born on St. Lucia as well. And this was a very united, loving group. We consulted without any problem. We were all oriented, action-oriented people. We started youth classes, children's classes all over the island. I think one of the best events, well, depending upon who you ask, one of the best events we had was the children's conference, the first one. We brought over 100 children from, see, Frank laughs, from all over, and from the different children's classes that were being taken, and it was a fantastic day. But if you could imagine this lovely grassy knoll place with no fences and nothing else, and 100 kids, you know, running all over, and we're trying to have 10 or 12 children's classes, so you're stepping over all these little kids when they're trying to do their little coloring, and they're all standing up there with their little signs that says where they're from, and they're all singing, "It's one man is one." Yeah. And at the end of the day, and Frank and Keith had to keep trying to keep, they were the guards, okay? So they were having to go around this perimeter of this children's conference and try to keep all these boys and girls inside this circle that we had set up. By the end of the day, after the buses had gone and we took everybody home, Steffi and I were just euphoric. It was one of the most fantastic days we'd ever had, to see over 100 children coming and singing the praises of Baha'u'llah and doing all their little things on the floor and being so excited and knowing about the children all over the place. Frank and Keith were totally wiped out. And they were saying, "Never again are we going to do that. If you ever have a children's conference, you get somebody else to take care of that." Anyhow, that was really great. We enjoyed that. This then, and I must also mention that the Castries youth, that group, you know, Juliana, Moses, all that group, they really were strong and firm in helping this thing, okay? They had their own activities as well. One of the other most exciting things, and even from a personal level for me, was that Stephanie had a dream one night, and in it that she had, it had come to her that we needed something to honor my grandmother, Grandma Snyder. So between us, we as a group, we decided to put together this teaching project, okay? And so we had the Grandma Snyder teaching project. And again, it became an international project, much like the one that we had in Barbados. But this one, the follow-up, was much better planned. Those are the ones that Nancy was talking about, those stories, and that's what got Nancy Cole down there actually stay. And it was really exciting. We went all over the island. They had the same problem with the Methodists, though. When the people were becoming Baha'is, they were living on the Methodist land, and they said, You want to be Baha'i, you move right off the land. Well, that cooled a lot of enthusiasm for this new religion, okay? But of this, what we did is we were able to form a nucleus and a core. This idea that Rahia Khanum talks about with this milk and this cream syndrome, that you need this enormous amount of cream, of milk, in order to receive the cream. And this is what we got from that project. We got some extremely strong believers who are still working with this, okay? I cannot leave St. Lucia without mentioning Moses Henry, okay? Moses Henry became a Baha'i through the Clarks, who were also pioneers there, and okay? And Moses was an older man. He was in his 60s. When he became a Baha'i, Beverly had given him his first book. Beverly March had given him his first book a few years back. And he then he said it sat on the shelf. And then one day he just was grabbed, okay? And he went rushing all over trying to get this. And Moses became one of the strongest local supporters of the faith. And he knew everybody, and everybody knew him. If you had to travel somewhere with Moses, it took a 20-minute journey. It would take you 45 minutes, because he would stop. Hey, come, man! I want to tell you about the Baha'is. Come, listen. And everybody said, "Oh, yes, Mr. Mose," you know, and they would move right along and listen to it. Strong. The man was giving his first feast, and he was selecting the writings, and in it he came upon the Tablet of Purity by Abdu'l-Baha, and the man had been a smoker all of his life. And when he read that Tablet of Purity, he said, "That's it. I'm not smoking anymore again." He threw away his pipe, threw away his tobacco, and he kept it. He never smoked again. Imagine being able to give up that kind of a 65-year-old habit right then. When there was an international convention, he went. Anything for the faith. Anything and everything. The man was marvelous.